Good evening. It seems to be the latest trend worldwide, especially with some Western countries that are desperate to repair struggling economies. US President Barack Obama, in his second term, is expected to go through with it, and he's not expected to take any prisoners. French President Francois Hollande fought an election on this and won. Yes, you guessed it, we are talking about taxing the so-called super rich of the country. The definition of super rich is not clear yet, but economists say that the number of declared wealthy taxpayers is too small to make a substantial difference to the country's fiscal health. India has nearly 35 million taxpayers, but only 1.7 million have a declared income of more than 10 lakh rupees. Nearly 89% say that their income is under 5 lakhs. India's leading economists have also pitched this idea. C. Rangarajan, chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, has called for higher taxes on persons with incomes beyond a specified threshold. This proposal is ostensibly to help reduce the widening fiscal deficit as well as bridging the expanding wealth gap. Needless to say, India Inc. is up in arms at even the mere suggestion of it. Industry argues that there should not be any increase in taxes for the super rich, as it would dampen business sentiments and lead to relocation of professionals to low tax regions, say like, for example, Singapore, Dubai and London. However, while the US, Britain, France and Australia have gone ahead and raised taxes on the rich to bring down their deficits, opponents of the idea argue that the same policy may not work in India, given its historical record. Citing the high tax regime in India when income tax rates soared to 97% in 1973-74, industry experts argue that the result was not more tax adherence but rather massive tax evasion back then, which resulted in black money transaction increasing manyfold. The rich in India account for as much as 63% of the total revenue the government collects from personal income tax. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight on The Big Picture, we discuss the feasibility of such a plan. Will such a move be effective, or will it turn out to be counterintuitive? And joining me tonight in the studio is Himangshu Watts, Energy and Infra Editor with the Economic Times, as well as tax expert Gagan Kumar. We'll also be joined by Prasenjit Bose, who's also an economist, in just a bit. Many thanks, gentlemen, for joining me on The Big Picture tonight. I'd like to start with you, Himangshu, if I could.
Yeah.
First up, I want to get your thoughts on the idea itself. Before we get to the nitty-gritty, so to say, should India follow the model that Obama wants to implement in the US? And are you, in principle, in agreement with the idea that the super rich or people who make a lot of money should be taxed more? And if yes, then why?
Okay, there are two sides to it. One, in an ideal world, it makes a lot of sense and it's very politically correct that if you have more money, we should get more tax from you. And if somebody else has lesser money, you should have lesser tax from that person. But in reality, the tax experience in India is that, when tax rates were brought down, collections actually went up. Now, this may not, please a poor person or a low-income person pretty much. So the government has to be clear, do you want to make an ideological, politically correct statement, or do you want more revenue?
Moral high ground.
Yeah. So if it's a moral high ground, it may not be a fiscal high ground. So one has to be very clear on that. When it comes to other countries, the countries you mentioned, like the United States and some countries in Europe, they are evolved, mature economies with a very efficient tax structure, right, administration and enforcement. What happens in India is the moment the tax is raised and the taxpayer thinks that this is cheating, there are 1,000 things he can do. There are many professionals who, make a living out of this. There are avoidance, evasion, there would be some gray areas. Take the example of estate duty. It was imposed, and you hardly collected anything. What people did was they came up with a very complex set of companies which owned the asset. And finally, when there was an inheritance, there was no transfer from one individual to his inheritor.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
So, I don't think it's practically a very good idea to raise taxes.
Fair point. I want to get your opinion on this, Gagan, as well. Do you agree with what Himangshu says, or do you have a different opinion on this particular issue?
See, historically we have a saying that tax and logic are strangers. So saying that essentially it would be a Robin Hood theory that tax the rich and work for the welfare of the people. That's true, but what happens is that when you seek to tax super rich, you essentially encourage a parallel economy or a tax evasion atmosphere. And as Himangshu pointed out, that it's ultimately going to benefit those lawyers and accountants who advise tax planning tools. So on the one hand, we are trying to bring direct tax code and aim to simplify the procedures On the other hand, we are seeking to tax those people who in any case are contributing to the economy. So in my view, the suggestion or the solution would lie in the fact that if we can try and increase the tax base, because as you rightly pointed out that having such a large population and only a meager population out of that is actually paying tax and tax above 10 lakhs, which is hardly, we are sitting in metros, but which is not a significant amount. So I guess the solution should be looked into in enhancing the tax base rather than taxing more those who are already paying tax.
Right, fair point. And I want to take it up from the point that Gagan just made right now. What about steps like looking at, say, the inheritance tax? You mentioned the inheritance tax, and for that matter, affluent individuals who've grown really rich on income coming from agricultural sources.
Yeah.
Now, agricultural sources, like, that's something that's not taxable in this country. Couldn't taxing agricultural income be an alternative way as well?
Most certainly. Look, this is a very, very politically laden
It's like a political
issue. Yeah,
hot potato.
it's a hot potato.
Hot potato.
See, historically, you had a country where, the Mughals, the rulers in that time really extracted money from the rich. You had the East India Company, what was its core competence? Collecting revenue from peasants in Bengal. So you had a very heavily taxed peasantry, and therefore, very rightly, upon independence, we said we'll not tax these people.
Right.
But what has happened today is that these farmers and peasants who are actually tilling the land, they are committing suicides. But it are these rich people who show very craftily that a lot of my income has actually come through an agricultural route.
Right.
Now, there is absolutely no logic by which this should not be taxed. And I think certainly, you can have a threshold that for income above X number of lakhs,
Right.
anything you have in agriculture will have the same tax.
Should we have a relook at the inheritance tax? Is that something that we can look at instead of saying, oh, tax the super rich and
I would say it's first look at the inheritance tax. We never had this concept, but we do have wealth tax in place.
Yeah.
And the threshold is not that significant. So essentially, people are paying wealth tax, those who are really wealthy. And if the idea is, and if the government is committed to tax super rich, then they can probably think of increasing the tax rate on the wealth tax as against the current 1%. They can increase even another 1% would add sufficient amount of tax revenue in the kitty.
Right. I want to give our viewers just one bit of information. India taxes the income at 3 rates, 10%, 20% and 30%. These rates were fixed in 1997 by the current finance minister, Mr. P. Chidambaram. Who's also called recently for a debate on the need for inheritance tax in India, wondering if the country had paid enough attention to accumulation of wealth by a select few. Now, what I want to ask you, Gagan, now is there is a significant difference in the circumstances and the economies of the Western world and ours. Agreed? According to official data, and these are numbers from the government, the number of effective taxpayers in India is just around 34 million people, around 33 point something million people. This amounts to just 2.77% of the over 1.2 billion population in our country. That's a shocking statistic for any country. So given this low level of tax adherence, is it possible that, I think you've already answered it, but I'd like to go in a little bit more detail. Is it possible that it could prove to be counterintuitive to expect a big difference by taxing the super rich even further?
See, a lot of things which may really affect this decision. One, currently, yes, the market is predominantly in the emerging countries like India, Brazil, China. So, yes, the people, it would not be easier for anyone to shift base, as has been suggested by the industry, that may lead us to migration to those tax efficient countries. But nonetheless, yes, it would be a negative sentiment, and people would not feel encourageous to invest in money in the developing countries.
Right, right. Himangshu, I'll come to you in just a bit. I want to take a small break right now. I'm going to come back and discuss this in further detail. Also, the steps that we can take perhaps to increase and widen our tax net. Also, the reactions that India Inc. or industry, as we call them, is giving to this particular idea. That's after the break. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the big picture. We're discussing the idea that some leading economists, including Mr. Rangarajan, who is, of course, the PMEAC chairman, has suggested that perhaps India should look into taxing the super rich even further. Remember, the super rich, that the particular term hasn't been defined yet. Himangshu, Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance, its chairman, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, ex-finance minister, pretty active in the political circle as well, he said on Thursday, I think last Thursday, that taxing the super rich was a bad idea since it would hurt the honest and the salaried more than anyone else. The logic is that if you're defining the super rich as people with an income of 10 lakh annually, you are hitting no one but the upper crust of the middle class and not the real super rich or high net worth individuals. Do you agree with that?
That's correct. Because people who have a salaried income, their income is disclosed by the company, and there's nothing you can do about it. It will get deducted at source. Whereas people, say a shopkeeper or a small businessman or a bigger businessman, they have a lot more latitude in declaring the income, where it has come from, declaring costs. For example, a middle class person, he buys an air conditioner that goes from his post-tax salary. Whereas if you are in some kind of a business, you can show it as an asset you bought for your business.
Right.
So they're already avoiding a lot of that tax. So if the threshold is at the level of upper middle class salaries, that's going to create a lot of heartburn. And in a situation where already you have a fairly disillusioned middle class,
I think fairly disillusioned is an understatement.
Yeah, a city like Delhi where teenagers are ready to go to the street day after day. I don't think it's going to be a very good situation for the country to have this kind of urban disillusionment.
Do you agree it'll hit the salaried more and the upper middle class more than anyone else?
Certainly, because you see, historically, ever since India's independence, we have been a capital-starved country.
Yeah.
And capital introduction is the biggest need of the hour, despite being 20 years of reforms. And I'm not a great advocate of FDI, but one good thing which FDI has done is the organizing these sectors. The organized sector has grown substantially, and that is what has led to the indirect tax collection more than the direct tax collection. And as Himangshu pointed out, it's the small shopkeepers or the small merchants who are still outside the net of tax. Though government has made certain amendments, certain rules that you have to disclose certain transactions beyond a threshold and trying to get hold of those people, but it's still a long way to go.
Right.
And certainly salaried people are the most honest taxpayer, I would say. They don't have a choice, actually.
Absolutely. So perhaps Mr. Yashwant Sinha has a point there, and there is increasing defiance to this particular idea. Mr. Chidambaram is supposed to be the darling of the markets. He's been playing, he's been playing very nice to the markets and the industry for the past 4 months since he's been finance minister. There is also the argument, Himangshu, that higher taxes encourage evasion. Like you said, it can encourage evasion, and empirical evidence would suggest that the direct tax to GDP ratio goes up when tax rates are slashed. Industry is also preferring idea that widen the tax net instead of just taxing the super rich. That's a better way forward, say economists. Nearly 60% of the economy is out of the tax net currently, if you look at the numbers, and tax collections from services, which account for more than half of the economy, are less than 1% of GDP. Shouldn't then we be discussing a different approach, namely what Mr. Vijay Kelkar had suggested in his report on tax reforms, that is better tax administration. If you go back to the Kelkar tax reforms, the whole philosophy was to go back to simplicity, lower tax rates, eliminate or substantially reduce exemption. But what is the problem here then? Why is better tax administration in this country very difficult?
So it's a question of the evolution of the overall administrative system in this country. Today, you ask an educated upper middle class person that if he has a choice, will he go to the income tax officer? Will he go to the police station? Will he go to any government public interface? And the answer is a very emphatic no.
No. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a need to change this perception, and which can be changed by actual change on the ground. Even today, after anything, a person who's been driving for 20 years, if he wants to renew a license,
You'll think twice before going to the RTO.
No, 80% of the people I know, if not 90%, will go to the local motor driving school and he will charge some 500,000 rupees or whatever and do that. So that perception has to change, including courts, including the income tax department. I'm not saying the department is at fault, but there's an overwhelming perception. And this, I think, goes back to the days of the 97% income tax rate, where it was socially stupid to be an honest taxpayer. You know, in the rich circle, when you're talking to each other, and if there's one person who's saying, look, I am going to expand and 97% of this income is going to go to the government, that was just ruled out. And I think the roots of this flourishing and expanding black economy is from there. Because then the tradition goes on to the next generation.
Right, right.
So there is need to have a much simpler and a friendly tax administration regime.
You're the tax expert, Gagan. How can we achieve that? Why is it so difficult for better tax administration to actually happen in this country? Where are we lacking? Is the government lacking? Is our mindset the problem?
I guess it's more of a mindset problem. We have witnessed those times when tax rates used to be high, and each taxpayer was viewed as with suspicion that whatever he's disclosing, at least he's hiding the equal amount of money. But unfortunately, that mindset hasn't changed so far. Of course, the new officers are more open. They do appreciate that, okay, if you're disclosing your income, you are honest, we accept it. But still, the mindset need to be changed, and that's the key to the better tax administration. And unless that administration is improved, taxpayers are not forthcoming in filing their honest tax returns. Because you see, minor issues like seeking a refund of 5,000 or 10,000 rupees, though government has taken initiatives where electronic transfers have been made possible, but even then someone need to click the button.
Right, right.
So that mindset needs to be.
But what I wanted to ask you was that if we have the Kelkar panel report on tax reforms, he says go back to simplicity. He says go back, widen the tax base, widen the tax net. Why is it so difficult for the government to actually implement those? What is the structural problem here? Himangshu or Gagan? Anyone who wants to?
See, it's not just limited to the tax department. It is the overall
perception of government.
Not just perception, the execution of governance
The execution
also.
of governance.
You know?
Yeah.
So, I think it's a gradual process. The outbursts against corruption, certain political implications of public anger with all this. I think it's a slow process of changing the system. Because as of now, if I can help it, I don't want any interface with any authority.
Right.
That is the general approach.
And that is the biggest problem we have.
Yeah, and I think things are improving. I mean, if you compare it with, say, 10 years ago, I think things are a bit better.
Right.
Citizens have a little more rights, at least in the metropolitan and urban areas. But people still say that, if you go to a tier 2, particularly tier 3 city, to try and get even a college certificate, you got to pay a bribe, and it's pretty, blatant and shameless.
Absolutely.
That, kaam karna, okay, give me this much money.
Right.
So I think there is a slow improvement, but the idea is to accelerate this process.
Right, absolutely. I think we'll take another small break right now. When we come back, we'll discuss whether or not to expect any announcement on taxing the super rich in this particular budget. Mr. Chidambaram, like I said before, is the darling of the markets right now in the industry. He's been playing tango with the markets and has been very successful in actually getting some more capital inflow into the country. We'll discuss all that and more on the other side of this break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the big picture. Taxing the super rich, people say, Himangshu and Gagan, that is tantamount to hitting the markets on the head with a blunt instrument. This is the kind of reactions we're getting from India Inc. The rich, they say, always have options for their cash, as most market-obsessed news portals, and some of them I was reading in the morning, they've been screaming all day. They'll tell you Chidambaram cannot afford to accept the super rich too much, or else the so-called FIIs or FIIs flows will dwindle, and that's not what the government wants right now. In this backdrop, and the fact that Chidambaram has a monstrous task ahead of him, with the budget looming, with the fisc going all awry, and the current account deficit, and not to mention the political consideration that he'll have to take into consideration, do you think that we can see an announcement on taxing the super rich in this particular budget? What is your opinion on that?
See, seeing Chidambaram's track record, starting from that 97-98 budget and from the day he's become finance minister, we've seen him take a series of difficult decisions.
Right.
And I think they've been very well calibrated in their dissemination. We've had this, it was a very surprising situation for me that you increase diesel prices and there's practically no protest.
Right. Right.
And from where economy was, and it was very rapidly sliding, where the rupee was, he has done some, brought some order. So given his track record, I don't think he'll do something to scare away investment.
In this particular budget.
Yeah, I don't think he'll do something drastic.
Right, right. Do you agree, Gagan, that nothing drastic is going to come in this particular budget?
Yeah, I think last year's retrospective amendments people are still to get over, so I don't think that would be a good idea to introduce such taxation in this budget.
And you obviously think that he might be talking about it, he just wants opinions to come and then perhaps he can take a decision maybe next budget.
I guess it's part of the pre-budget discussion, so this is one idea on the table, but I don't think it would be ultimately implemented.
Right, right. We've also been joined by Prasenjit Bose, who of course is slightly late, but we're glad to have him on the show. Thank you so much, Prasenjit, that you could make it. We were discussing, of course, the idea that the finance minister and some economists have floated that India should tax its super rich. Let me just get your reaction on that particular question. Where are you ideologically in principle? Are you okay with the fact that if you earn more, you should get taxed more?
Absolutely. I think that is a principle that is followed all across the world. And if you look at the situation in our country, even within the BRICS countries, India has, I think, the lowest tax GDP ratio even compared to peer developing countries, and forget about the more advanced countries which have even far higher tax GDP ratios. So in this kind of a situation, and the fact that the tax base in India is very narrow,
Right.
we are a country of 125 crore people, I think below 4 crore people actually pay taxes.
It's like 2.77% of the population.
Yeah, so in such a scenario, and the fact that there is a difficult fiscal situation, neither you have to keep on adding the burdens of the Aam Aadmi, like, the decontrol of diesel prices, the hike on railway fares and so on and so forth, or you have to mobilize more revenue. And the only way to mobilize more revenue is to mop it up from the rich, from the super rich who has the capacity to pay.
But let me put another question to you.
Yeah.
They haven't defined what super rich really is
Yeah,
right now.
I think yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So that is the point. And I was just hearing the fellow panelists talking about, it should nothing should be done to disincentivize investors.
Right,
I think
right.
I think the point is that we are a country where simultaneously there's a very large number of poor people, among the largest poor population in the world. We also have over 50 dollar billionaires who find their place in the Forbes rich list. So I think that when you are defining super rich, you have to define it not in terms of personal income. I think that is not the point. Personal income taxes in India are fairly, the rates are fairly okay. What needs to improve are, I think, three things. Number one, the wealth tax in India is abysmally, the collection is about 1,000 crore. Out of say 10 lakh crore of taxes that we collect every year, it's only 1,000, it's a pittance. Whereas you have a huge amount of wealth concentrated in very few hands. So I think wealth tax needs to go up. Second, dividends are taxed at a very low rate compared to what otherwise profits are. So thirdly, the capital gains tax, long-term capital gains tax, like from the share market. If you are making profits, you pay taxes at 30%. From the share market, long-term capital gains tax 0%.
Right, right.
So these are the areas where I think definitely the rich has to be taxed more.
Let me just come to you because you were slightly late. I want to get as much time with you as possible. There is this view, and Parliamentary Standing Committee on Financial Affairs, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, the chairman there, he says that doing this, defining people who are super rich as people who earn 10 lakh income annually and taxing them more would actually hit the upper crest of the middle class, the salaried professional, the honest taxpayer, rather than any high net worth individuals. Do you agree with that? That the biggest brunt, would be...
It should. See, I mean, I think definitely someone who is earning more than 10 lakhs is rich. But whether that comprises the super rich, I don't know. My point is that taxation should, today in India, taxation should target to mop up more revenues from the super rich in terms of the billionaires, dollar billionaires. You are talking about a very thin crust who have a huge amount of money, and most of it, by the way, are lying as idle cash reserves.
Right.
Nothing is happening, productive is happening. But secondly, I think I would love to see far more effort in a crackdown on black money.
Right.
I think a lot of resources in India are simply, they are illicit money. They are going out of the country. They are being stashed abroad. They are being rerouted through the Mauritius route and so on. So just taxing the super rich is not enough. I think there has to be a far greater compliance of tax laws in
I think
India.
that's an important point because if you just tax the super rich, you'll actually increase the black money.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, Prasenjit. There is this theory that if you increase tax rates, evasion is going to happen and increase.
I find that to be a cynical argument. It is like saying that, since people in our country don't abide by laws, let us not have any laws.
Right.
Point is that do you want to improve as a country?
Right.
Do you want to improve your tax administration? Do you want to improve the law enforcement machinery?
Right.
I think that any
Himangshu has a
forward-looking
point.
person.
Briefly.
The point is, there's no point having a law if you cannot enforce it. That's
Right.
the point.
So
Not that
implementation
don't
is
have
the
a
No,
point.
law.
but why can't you enforce it? Because
fine.
your super rich is a selfish lot, because they don't care whether people have food to eat or they have clean drinking water. They don't mind, people dying, not going to school. And you also have corruption within the tax enforcement machinery. So do you think that we should keep on for decades and decades living in this
But do
kind
we
of a
all
state?
agree that better tax administration is also a way
Yes.
going forward? And
Yes.
that's,
I think that's much more important
That's-
because
that's-
without that, it doesn't make practically you will gain nothing.
Last point, yeah, we
Without
have very,
administration.
very little time left. Yeah.
Yeah, just one last point. If I have a security guard outside standing my gate, I would be happy to pay his salary. So if I'm paying taxes, I would want that money is used for my welfare.
Right,
And if
right.
it is being used for my welfare, I would not mind paying
Right,
taxes.
fair point. I'll have to stop you there. We are completely out of time. I must thank all my guests before I sign off. Prasenjit Bose, you came late, but thank you so much for coming and giving us your views. Gagan, Kumar, thank you so much for coming as well. Himangshu, that's all the time we have. Unfortunately, this time I'm not going to give in key takeaways because we have no time left. Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching The Big Picture.